Hello everyone, my name is Tudor Girba. I am the co-founder of Think, and the goal of Think is to reshape the development experience. So that's what we do, which basically most of the time this means that we build tools. And today I'm super happy to be here because we're going to announce the first alpha version of the next generation Glamorous Toolkit. Any of you heard of Glamorous Toolkit before?
Yes.
Okay, who didn't? Okay, so but before we talk about what's new, I'd like to take a step back and see what is the Glamorous Toolkit. Because we talk about it a lot or often. Maybe we get to use it, but maybe it would be good to have a bit of a perspective. So we introduced the Glamorous Toolkit 4 years ago, and the core of it became part of Firo. It was not a smooth ride, but it was an interesting ride. And as a consequence of it is that our goal was to change the way we look at software, the way we perceive software. And the core feature of the Glamorous Toolkit was that it was moldable. And by moldable, we mean it was programmable while you were working with it so that you can adapt to the context. And why context? Because we think that software is the most contextual thing that we've ever created as human species. So we really need our tools to adapt to that context rather than be rigid and always show you the same view all the time. So last year, I gave a presentation here at ESUG, and I showed an actual case study. And this case, for a long time, so for several years, we applied Glamorous Toolkit in our technical context, right? So looking at compiled methods and classes and files and, other kinds of data structures that have meaning from a technical perspective. But last year, we did something else. And we showed an example of how we approached a business problem. We approached a business domain in a different way. And then that became kind of interesting. And that domain was a restaurant domain. So we drew this, maybe some of you remember, we drew this on the whiteboard with the business people and the developers. And this was an interesting model of how to capture what's inside the restaurant. And what's really interesting was a great brainstorming session, but at the end of it, people said, oh, but this is not, we don't see ourselves doing it. This is just, we're doing CRUD operations over here. And you're talking about, actor models and I don't know what. So they didn't see themselves necessarily doing it. So we took our time, and after a month, we implemented this model in Firo in this case. And what you're looking here at is a playground plus an inspector showing essentially the same kind of visualization that we drew on a whiteboard. And this one basically unlocked the whole process of developing or redeveloping that whole project, and it was really, really great. But at some point, maybe a few months afterwards, because the project was actually implemented in Java, and it was implemented one-to-one in Java. The model turned out to have about 300 entities. It was rather extensive, and each of those entities was viewable from various different kinds of perspectives, and that was really, really interesting because we could actually get conversations going with business, like literally having pair programming, like 10 or 15 minutes pair programming between a technical person and a business person, and they would actually look at an object inspector and say and derive something meaningful out of it. This was really a completely different kind of an experience that we would think of, because most of the time, people in business, they are literally, or not most of the time maybe, but very often, they're literally scared. Because software is a black box. It's a magic thing that you just put something in and it gets you something out, and nobody knows what it does inside. That's really scary when you actually need to make decisions of where you need to invest things. It's really, really scary. But if you open the box and you find out that the box is actually approachable, it completely changes the mental frame in which people relate to software. And that's an amazing thing. But the coolest realization came after people have implemented this in Java. So a few months down the line, this thing happened. So the object to the right, so what you see to the right is an object inspector in a reasonably popular Java IDE, and it actually shows the same object that we see to the left. Right? Now this is a fundamentally different experience. It's not cosmetics, it's fundamentally different. Because everybody looks at the thing to the right. And we think people should look at the thing to the left. It's not cosmetics, it's really, really different. And I would be scared too if I would look at it, to the right too. Because it is scary. And those two things are identical. And that was a great thing. So what did we learn from this? What we learned from this was that if you change and control the shape of software, you can fundamentally affect the way we approach software. Now, it's not about language. Right? It's not about how we program. It's about how do we relate to software. And notice how when we talk about this, it's a feeling. Do you feel the feeling? There is somewhere here. That's a feeling. We have thought about software for so long, and then we end up in a situation where most people are scared of it. And when most developers don't particularly like working with existing systems. And that's a terrible situation to be in, and it has to be reinvented. So that's the reason why we worked quite intensely on a different way of approaching this problem. So now, the Glamorous Toolkit is the new generation of it. Took everything we learned from the first one, and then we think it's a leap. So if the first one provided the difference from the classical way of looking at software, we think that the new generation is as much a leap forward. So let me explain to you what does that mean. As I said, well, we learned that the shape of software is really, really critical. Well, and then we looked around and said, well, how do we express things? Right? We express it at the moment, if you're looking at a screen, you're expressing using a graphical user interface. Well, if the shape of software is really critical, it must mean that that shape of the graphical user interface must be as flexible as possible. Right? And we again looked around, and we were not quite happy with what we found. And that's why for the last 3 years, we worked on a new stack. And the stack looked like this. So Sparta is a canvas that works on top of, it's an abstract canvas that lives in Faro. And it abstracts away different kinds of rendering, different kinds of backends, and it can be hosted in different places. So by hosting, we mean that it can live in maybe in a morphic window, or it can be in a system window. But then on top of it, we have a graphical or a basic graphical user interface, which is called Block. This was a project started earlier by Alan Plantek and Stefan Dukas, and we started to invest heavily in it 3 years ago. And one of the key things when we started to work there was to add relentlessly, and to work relentlessly to obtain one property. That one property, put one property in that thing, in the graphical user interface. And that one property is called one rendering tree. It was a little bit fuzzy at the time when we started, because we had no idea how to build graphical user interfaces really. So we had to learn. But what it means is that at any given point in time, when you look at the screen, you should see exactly one single rendering tree. And I'll explain during the talk why that is important. So on top of Block, we have Brick, which is a widget library. And all of these are essentially right now reaching an alpha state. And I'd like to give you a short demo. If that's okay, or should I?
A question, maybe?
Yes.
So what do you mean by single visual tree? When do you have multiple visual trees?
No, we don't. We wanted to have exactly one.
But I cannot imagine when you have multiple. I always have one.
Oh, so a very good, so the question is, what does it mean to have exactly one single rendering tree? A good example is, let's say, when you have HTML, and in HTML you embed an SVG. So the HTML is one rendering tree, and the SVG is another rendering tree. And you embed the two, but they are two different worlds. Right? So they can be hosted in one another. But so the problem there is it's very hard to go across the border, and sometimes impossible. And so we wanted to not have that. Okay. So, let's see. So I'll start by, the demo that I'm showing is hosted in Morphic right now, which means that we use Morphic not to render anything. So the frame here is Morphic, but everything inside the frame is a whole new world that has nothing to do with Morphic. It's a completely new stack, right? So everything that you see rendered here is a completely new stack. Okay, so let's basically start. So I'll start here by typing a bit, and notice that we have some completion. The completion is again a new thing. So we have now, let's say that we want to look at a folder called Think. And if I execute that, a couple of things happen. So this is the usual experience that you had before. You had a playground, and then you execute something, and then you see the preview to the right. And then this preview, we have different kinds of representations for the object. So in this case, given it is a folder, then we see the items inside that folder. But there are a couple of other things that we see. So let's play a bit with not just with the conceptual things, but also with how those things actually look. Because we think details are important. Because if we are about the feeling, right, those little details, they actually matter in how we feel and how we relate to things. Okay, so let's take a step back. So if I close this one again, now I realize, well, I don't have that object anymore. Right? I maybe executed it, maybe it took a long time, but I don't have it. But actually, I do have it, because it's right here. There's a button embedded right in the text. And if I click on that button, I get the object back. Okay, it's a tiny thing, but it's actually not tiny. So if I now continue to type here, the button disappears because it no longer matches the code that I executed. Right? So again, if I just, let's say that I'm here, I close the preview, and if I just do it now, I just press Command D, and I just do it. Right? So I forgot to preview it. As a consequence, I don't have that preview. So normally, in typical experiences, you would have to do it again, and you would pay the penalty of actually executing the same thing again. But given that we don't want to do that, if I click on that button, now I have it. Right? The other thing that you might notice is that we can resize things as we want. And then there are these little tiny things, right? Such as a button that goes a little bit out the window, because why not? And yeah, so let's see. Another thing that is also interesting is that clicking here does not spawn by default a preview. This was a thing that was breaking the workflow sometimes in the previous incarnation, because every time you would click, you always spawn. So if you want to do some work in a specific place, you couldn't do it because it always would shift first, and then you would do the work. So that was a usability. But if I double click, then I get it there. Or equally, if I'm here, let's say, and I click on something, let's start from scratch. If I'm at this folder, I'm looking at it, I select, notice how there's a triangle that goes out of it. Right? And if I click on that triangle, it also appears. So as soon as I have a preview, then I will show the preview there. But only if I want to. So this is there's an explicit trigger that you would like to get there. Right? So notice also how there's a little bit of a scroll bar at the top that basically increases and decreases as we enlarge or decrease the size. Right. So this is a very brief overview of what the playground is. Right. So it's kind of similar to how it was there before, but perhaps there are a couple of differences. So here, right, if we do the preview, we can also scroll like this. And so here's one thing that we added. We scroll with the touchpad, like you would do with a normal Mac application. Right. So again, let's do it again. So if I did something here, there was a rendering, and then it appeared, because this is a large picture. And so the inspector never breaks, basically, at this point in time. It's always going to be, it's always going to provide you with something. Okay, questions so far? Yeah, question there.
Can you delete the boxes in the middle if you are...
Can we delete the boxes in the middle? We could, but we don't want to. And there is a reason for that. So the reason you got to this place, right, this is an interesting and it's a powerful concept because it provides you the context of what were the steps that you took. If you want to now delete something in the middle, then you're doing something with your context. And that's not a good thing. That's why we are only allowing you to delete visually, going from right to left.
Or at least hide them.
That's one thing that we will do. So we will, yeah. And the idea would be collapse them to one tiny line. But yes. Other questions? Great. So, yeah. So now we have these. But as I said, what we care about is we care about to change. So to push the boundaries of what is possible. So what you're seeing here is still something that is reasonably within reach, even, okay, maybe slightly different with a little bit of cosmetics, but it's still possible. The same things are still possible within the current infrastructure. So what is maybe less easily possible? And one of the things that we played with is this idea of documentation. So what do we mean by that? So here I have a file, and let's take a look at it. And so it's in our repository. It's a project called Visualizer, and there is a doc about Mondrian. So if we look at it, there is index.pillar, which is a pillar file. And if I double click on it, something magic happens. And the magic is that we have a live documentation there. So we just embedded here an example, and in that example, you can see a preview. So here what you're seeing is actually an inspector embedded in a document, which is embedded in another inspector. Right? And then the question is, what do we do with it? So what's interesting about it? So there are a couple of things that are interesting. First of all, what's interesting is that we can put together very quickly documentation. So if you think we talked about how business people felt, how do developers feel about documentation? Right? Nobody really likes documentation. But documentation is really interesting. So why don't we make it an interesting thing? So what we wanted to achieve was to make the writing of the documentation and the consumption of the documentation to happen within the integrated development environment. Because, by the way, what does integrated stand for? What does it mean? It means every time you have to leave, the integrated has failed. Right? Because it's not integrated. So if you have to look for documentation somewhere else, we've done something wrong. Because it's not the right thing. And so the question was, can we not change this and make it upside down? And so the same content, if I look at the content, is really not that large. It's really this one. But if I look at the result, right, I get something that is reasonably rich. Right? There is a tutorial there. And there are examples there. And there is code. And all of it is testable. Because we have not copy-pasted any piece, any line of code. Everything is totally testable. Because this is how we work. So what we see here is, we see an inspector, right? We said, this is the preview of the example. So we see the inspector there. Which means now that I should be able to interact with it, because it's a live picture. Now what happens if I click on it, right? I said, if I click on things, I expect to see them sometimes. Right? If I click on this one, for example, I expect to see it somewhere. Right? So I click on that, and notice how the triangle appeared. So now if I click on the triangle and I scroll, I get to my object. So now I'm inside the documentation, and the documentation gives me that possibility of what should I do? And that's very, very interesting. Because it turns out that documents are very, very central in software development. So very often, this is where the starting point is, right? We have a Confluence, we have a Word that is flying around, and people copy-paste and bounce back and forth between documents, or maybe a PDF. Documents are really a very interesting universal platform which bridges the gap, crosses that gap between technical people and business people. Which means now that if I take, let's say, if I just want to focus on this document over here, right, and I want to abstract away of everything else, right, and I press on this plus button, so now I zoomed into that specific part, I'm just looking at that pane in my inspector. This is something that potentially a non-technical person can relate to. And what you put in there is completely up to you. Now you would say, well, what can I put in there that can be interesting? That's why I said that the experience we had last year validates the idea that business people can get interested into the internals of the object, because of the system, because everything inside the software system is exciting, if you make it so. And the difference between it being exciting enough is just the shape. Yeah, that's a question.
Presumably this also supports the GT Tools custom inspectors for your own objects?
Yeah, so these are all custom inspectors here.
Yeah, right. So all the extensions will also allow you
all
to
inspect. So if once you build something onto once you build something into the inspector, it's immediately available inside, right? Inside the doc. And you don't necessarily have to show always the inspector, the full inspector. You can also show parts of it if you want. So one thing sometimes is that the question is, so sometimes people want to learn. So if I now zoom out, I just go back to my original flow, right? So I zoom in, and then I'm zooming out. So one interesting thing here is, let's see, how is this implemented? Because discoverability, right? We said, well, moldability is important, which means that developers will extend their tools while they will work with them, but then it also means that you want to, when you see something, you want to really learn from it, right? And so here, if I take this presentation here, and if I click on it, I say, in this case, it's Alt-click, then I get to the implementation of that extension, right? So let's click on that one, that's the contents, this is the raw, this is the print. Right? So we also wanted to build discoverability of how you play with the tool right into the tool. And similar things apply to the action button. So if I click on that action button, it will tell me how the inspect thing is actually working. Right? Questions so far? How are we doing time? Okay. So yeah, so let's move on. So what can we do with this documentation? So a lot of our focus was really around the documents, because as I said, we noticed that documents is a language that can cross the boundaries to different kinds of stakeholders. So we saw here what we have. Once you have built examples, because we are doing example-driven development, and Andrei Kish will give a presentation about example-driven development later on during the day. So this replaces test-driven development. So because we're doing example-driven development, we already get those examples as part of our natural development flow. And then we just take the example and then we embed it into our document, and boom, we have the documentation. So this one describes what you can do right now, right? So it's a description, it's a documentation of existing code. But what about other kinds of things? So let's take a look. So here we have, for example, a description of the Glamorous Toolkit. It's not really a big description, but it's very often people ask us, so what is the Glamorous Toolkit made of? You know, what is inside? So here I have a piece of code, and so I just have a pillar there. And if I execute that, it takes a bit of time. And now here there's a project map that actually goes over the wire. And notice how we can do the resize. Let's make it a bit smaller. Notice how we can do the resize right in place. Right? So we are inside the text editor, we press the button there, and now we get a resize right there. Right? And so now it means that this is how this is how the different configurations are actually working together. So what the dependencies are. And again, if we click on any of them, we can see them on the right. Right? So again, it's a very different way of approaching it. And then, because we can do this, we also notice, so You notice how there is syntax highlighting of small talk directly in that in the code, in the small talk snippet only. So if we now play with this, right? So if I just don't go through the whole Metacello thing, but I just have something that is specific to the baseline of the Glamorous Toolkit, then I have a more meaningful map in this case. And that's an example of how, if you rely on the generic thing, you get some result. But if you go take the time and tweak it a little bit, then you get a qualitatively different type of a result, right? So here we played a bit with the label, and with create, and we are only seeing the direct dependencies, right? So those things with black, we see all the different projects. So notice how the Glamorous Toolkit is actually made of different components that are, on the one hand, isolated, so they are independent, but on the other hand, they are highly integrated. We think it's an important thing because we see the IDE as a first and foremost being a programmable interface.
Why do you rely on Smack?
Well, why do we rely on Smack? Because of we needed a more powerful way to deal with. So Smack is a parsing framework. How many of you does not know what Smack is? And so John Brandt is here. He will talk about Smack later during the week. And Thursday, yeah. And there will be another talk by Jason, yeah, on Smack as well. Smack, yeah, there you go. So Smack is really like a parsing framework, and what we wanted, this is a different completion engine, and we wanted to have, we wanted to be able to tweak it more than normal. So right now we're using the Smack-based parser for now. It's a partial parser that does not rely on the default parser. We have to see how we can unify the two words. But basically, we wanted to see how far can we push it. Okay, so but that's an example, right? It goes away. So this was an example of first is if you tweak the presentation to something that is specific to you, right? So instead of the generic visualization about Metacello, you get something that is more contextual. All of a sudden you can get more value out of it. And that value is first of all interesting for developers, but it becomes interesting for people to look at it. So how many of you understand what is it that you're looking at here? Who understands what you're looking at? Right? So that's what the value of documentation should be. When you look at this, right, you want it to be understandable. That's the very first thing. And the more contextual that thing is, the better the output is. Okay. So that's one thing. And then we can continue to explore things. So here, if I want to just find out what are the projects there, then we can see, right? So we can the whole experience is now is completely different. So, but then there is the other thing, right? Because now we got used with the previous version of the Glamorous Toolkit, we got used with one kind of a workflow. And now we have a different one. And we can guide the people's understanding of the space just by how we compose things together. And so it's a different way of creating presentations about software systems. Questions? Yeah.
I think this is fantastic, and I love the idea, as you know. The challenge, I think, is to scale this to support multiple users against the same knowledge, the same information.
The challenge it's to scale this thing to support multiple users.
Yeah.
We agree. So let's talk about this a bit later. So one other thing, so we saw here is, okay, you can describe things, but another thing that we can do is something else. So here's an example of a class. And if I look at that class, I look at its methods, this is an examples class, so it hosts examples. And if I look at it, right, I can see, okay, these are some, example things that. And the very interesting thing about examples, you think about them in very short terms, is they're basically like test methods, except that they return the result. It's a tiny change, but quite powerful because you can then compose them. So here we have those examples, right? So we can use them, because notice how there's assertions there. So we can use them for testing purposes, how we work. But then we say, okay, so in this case, it's about a toggle button. And Alexei Cyril will give a presentation again later today about brick. So this is one of the brick components. And so now that we have gone through the effort of actually building those, the examples. Now the question is, can we not put together a documentation? And the question is, where would you put this documentation? Right? And so what better place to put it than in the comment of the class? So notice how now, just because we embedded a few examples, now we have what? So this is a tutorial, and this is live, right? So you're just looking at the comments of a class, right? And so, and now we have, here's a button, and here's maybe, previous was with the icon, this one with the label, and this one with an icon and a label, and this one is the other way around, right? And then maybe this one actually changes shape as you click on it, right? So that's very interesting, because out of the many methods that you have seen here, only a few of them are interesting from a documentation perspective. So that's an interesting perspective there. And some of them maybe will be interesting for some audience, and other kinds of examples will be interesting for another audience. That's also another interesting thing to look at. But probably all of them are very often useful for testing, from a testing perspective. So that's why creating these documents that quickly put together a different point of view, plus the text in between, is a reasonably powerful tool. Right? Good questions? No. Great, so let's move on. So what else can we do with documentation? So one thing that we love about Pharo is that there are documentation. There's documentation about it, right? There's these books about it, and this is amazing. It's an amazing. It's an amazing effort that we have, right? So if you go to books.pharo.org, you see there are lots of books, and that's exciting. And so, but think about the experience, right? You get the book, you get a PDF or maybe an HTML, and then what? Well, there you have these tutorials that say, oh, now you go and create this class. And after you create that class, so what do you do when you create it? So you see the snippet, and you copy paste from there, and then you paste it in your environment. Well, again, I'm leaving. That's just not fun, right? We really want to make things fun. Why fun? Because the way I feel is important. Don't you think that the way you feel is important? Yeah, I think it is. So let's see, can we make it fun? I'm raising the bar here. So
you could access directly the GitHub pillar file.
We could, yes.
This is
No.
what I want.
Yeah. So now coming back to the question. So the question here was, can we scale this environment so that people that don't have any knowledge about Pharo can still find it interesting and engaging? So what do I have here? So what I have here is a player that I put a doc in, and what do I get? It's a player. There's nothing else. It's just another player, like you have many of them. That's it. And that's a completely different kind of an entry point into a programming world. Right? So, but what do we have here? So this is a tutorial about examples. So here you see, okay, so in this one we have, let's exemplify examples. So the first thing is we need to create an example tutorial class, right? So we will see it here, and this is all great. This is a new method that we have to create. So now I would theoretically have to, copy from there and paste it there, which is something that I don't necessarily want to do. Instead, I have an apply button here because I didn't copy paste in any piece of code. Instead, what I've done, I took advantage of the already existing changes mechanisms that is underneath Pharo, right? And now we just say, we cherry picked and says, out of those changes, some of them are exciting. These are the exciting ones. And then we're going to apply them. And as I apply that, there is no more diff. And notice how, because I embedded that thing over here already, right? I can see the preview, which is awesome, right? So now I can directly play with it, and I get it. So, and so on, right? So now, for example, here, in this particular snippet, we introduce a new pragma here. And so how do I know that it's that one? Well, it's because I want to look at the diff. So I'm looking at the diff to see what exactly has changed in my code. So let's apply that one. And if I go now back, the previous one has a diff, because now this one does not have, right? So this one has description, but this one does not have description. There should be a diff here, right? It says no description. So what else can I do with it? Well, so let's imagine that we have a browser. So now I'm just using this as a placeholder, and let's create something here. So I diverge a bit, because Learning is about taking something that exists and then going your own way and then exploring and finding things. And then at some point when you're tired of exploring and finding things, you want to go back to the original route, right? And then the question is, where was I? Right, so now if I save this one and I go back to my environment, it tells me, well, there's a diff there. Here, this one too many. So maybe you want to apply it and start from here. Does it make sense? Was this exciting? Was it? Yeah. So that's a few of the things that we've done. Now another thing is about how do we author such a document. So let's take an example here. We have an index builder here. Maybe I can put here some code. And notice as I type, there's a button that appears, right? The button gets inserted. Now, why is it important we have one rendering tree? Because we can insert inside the text editor anything we want, anytime we want. In fact, that thing was added by the syntax highlighter live as I was typing, which is, I think, pretty cool. So, now what else can we do with this, right? Because now we say, well, sometimes we need to insert a picture. So here we have a pictures folder. So how do we insert pictures here? We do file, / and notice something magic happens. Right? We get completion, right? So we say pictures, and now as I top, right, I get the completion inside, right? And if I say plus, I get this one. So how do you feel about it? Right? Is this not how you would want to write documentation? Because this is how I would, right? And then we can go on, because then we can say, well, what else can we do? Well, how about we embed classes, right? And then I say, well, here's a name, and maybe I say, maybe I want the object there to embed it there. And as I type, I can see the preview of it. Because why not? Or maybe a method. And now the method is a tiny bit more different, right? Because the method requires us a class and a method, right? It's not the same thing. I have two things that I have to complete. So let's see, is this up to the task? So we have method, and then I get a double click, and I get name of that thing. And so let's say, if I want to say in collection, maybe I want collection. Notice how there is the completion. It shows me that it goes all the way to up to that. And then maybe here there's a do, right? And then that's it. So, right? And now I get the completion of that method. Now, but examples, they're tiny bit different. Because the example is like a method, right? So I say example, and let's say I want something from object, and in the object there is exactly only one method that is annotated with example. Right, so then I do not see all the methods, I only see those that are annotated with example, which I think is again pretty cool. Right? So now if I embed this one, I get an example, and this one has a play button that I can just directly play with. Right? So this is how we think completion can be. So what you're seeing here with completion is that you have many levels of custom moldability of the completion itself, and we needed that flexibility, and that's why we are having a new kind of a completion engine. So you're seeing here completion at multiple level of abstractions inside the language. Okay, so questions so far? Yeah, one question.
I see you're editing pillar format files, right?
Yeah.
Can you use this to author like the books that are being published using the pillar format? Is that the same?
Can we publish this once we have it, right? Is this what you're saying?
Well, I'm asking the books, like the new learning.
Can we publish the whole books with it?
Yeah.
Let me get back to this a bit later.
Okay.
Just a tiny bit. So one other thing that we have played with is the following thing. So maybe you've noticed that when we start here, the playground, we have a plus button here. So what is it for? And I will go quickly through that one. We call those snippets. So sometimes you have something like this, right? And that something is you have a full set of, like a full thing. So here you have a visualization. So it gets all the directories in that thing, right? And then we have a little visualization. And this is Montreal. This is a cool new implementation on top of block. It's a very flat implementation there. And so interesting thing here is that we have two parts always. Whenever you deal with visualizations like this, first you get the data and then you visualize the data. Right? So there's always two parts, and you very often, if I change something here, maybe it's not a text element, it's something else, and I will have to select this thing and then again, right? And again, I don't feel right when I do that, so I don't want to do that. So a different way to approach this problem would be to have something like this. Right, in which here I have a snippet, and when I do it, I can play that one, but I will only execute that. And when I execute this one, it will execute only the second one. Right? It's a whole new world. It's a completely different kind of a snippet. And then you can create those kinds of, it's essentially like a document builder. Because the coolest thing is when you start to be able to combine these things, right? So what happens if I delete those? Oh, those are moldable too. So for example, if I go here to think, and notice if I press OK, there was a scroll bar that just went through it and it got me a response. So how do I know that it got a response? So if I click on it, I get the actual response with the headers and stuff, right? And if I press plus here and I say, well, I want a furrow, and I say here, I want a response, right? Then I actually get the same thing.
Can you give the folder different?
The folder different?
I mean, we have two notices.
Yeah, so right now, the whole thing is one single document that shares all the variables. And the same thing happens also inside the documenter. It's exactly one single place, right? So what this means now is that there is also a little bit of a hook to actually build and express widgets, like programs with widgets. Which, again, we can come back a bit later, but if people wanted to research this one, I think this is one of the coolest platforms in the world right now. Now, let's take a step back, right? So we saw that we went through the trouble of actually building a whole new graphical user interface because we wanted to express things fundamentally different, right? And so I showed you a couple of things. So as I said, we are announcing the Alpha 1 now, today. And this one contains a couple of different engines, so it's a dozen of them. And some of them are actual tools that you can click on, and some of them are engines that you can program. For example, the completion thing is somewhat a tool, but mostly an engine. But we also have visualizations. There's also Documenter, which is both a tool and an engine. But we also have just examples, or Flow, which are engines, pure engines that just help us build things differently. Okay, so this being said, right, I showed you lots of features. Right? I showed you lots of tools, but some of it so the documentation part got us really excited, and we worked quite a bit on that because we think this is like a huge space that was never ever explored. Now, when you have a huge space that was never ever explored, it's really hard to make progress. But it's also a very exciting opportunity. It's like the Wild West. Right? We just played with it. Now we have a piece, like Lego pieces in our hands. We just don't know what to do with them. Right? And basically we have learned from the Lego experience that after 50 years, there's still new things you can do with them. You just saw a car, a full-blown car working at 200 miles per hour, built out of 90% Lego bricks, which is an amazing thing. Nobody have thought about that when they invented the Lego bricks. And what we're saying is that right now we just built the Lego bricks. So now, to get the imagination a little going, I want to go back and say, well, what else can we do with this? Can we push it a step tiny further to see, can we look at software fundamentally different? Is there something to do there? So here's one thing. As I said, we have here an example. So one of the things that I showed before is that we can expand things. So when an example is using another example, you can expand that one in place, and then. But notice how the same thing. It's nice. It's awesome. Do you find this awesome? This is awesome. I think it's awesome. And especially that this is actually live, right? So. Just you can type there as you go, but it's still hard, and it's still a lot of text, right? But what you actually want to look at is actually dependencies between those examples, right? So how else can we look at that? So we have another representation there. So this is in this representation we have the same example, right? So we can scroll through that. We can also enlarge it and make it smaller as we wish. But there are these dots here, right? So what's the dot? So if I click on the dot, a new thing spawns, right? And if I click on another dot, another thing spawns. Right? And what happens if I scroll? the things go with the dot. So what do we say here? And now I come back to this one rendering tree thing. It's because we said it's fundamentally important that we need to control the way we represent things at the very core. And then we build things on top of it. Which goes back, it's very the same philosophy that the Smalltalk has, right? What's the smallest kernel that we need to bootstrap things? Right? So what's the minimum amount of things that you need to render some picture? And this is one tree. And so it's because of that that we can actually draw a line from inside the text. And that line is being added live, so if I, for example, remove something here, it gets deleted as I go. Right? Questions? So that's a different way of looking at it. So that was interesting. And another one was, well, can we also look at, an object inspector slightly differently? So here we have the same thing, and now I just opened it on an element that I showed before, and now we have connections here. So again, this is like the state view of the object. And maybe, let's say, we're going to do one for the geometry resizer. So as I open it, that's not a good thing. The event dispatcher, as I open it and I click on it, and I can see that here I have an owner that points back to my previous object, right? And again, it goes on like this, and I have a linear layout, and then there is this thing that all of a sudden, aligns itself to help me understand what I'm looking at better. And all of this is live. And the other thing that we can do with it is because, this is a nice representation, you can see links and so. But sometimes I just want to go and get a deeper understanding of what's going on there. So now we have here actually an inspector embedded inside there. And if I click on that one, right, maybe I get another inspector, another connector in there. Now, is this interesting? Or is this meaningful at this point? Maybe less so, the fact that I can embed those things. But that's what you do, what you can do once the properties are there, right? And we know this is the best, this is probably the best place in the world to explain what this is, because that's what Smalltalk, what's exciting about Smalltalk. You get those properties right at the core, then it enables whole new kind of innovations on top that are just completely unforeseeable. So, right, so one thing that I didn't get a chance to play with that much, so I'll just quickly go through it, is this idea of a debugger. So here is an example inside a document. I run it, and I get an exception. But I don't want to scare the user with an exception, right? So I just gently tell it that there is an exception there. Obviously, I just have a 1/0. So there's an exception, and there's a debug button. And the debug button gets me into this place, right? And now the interesting thing here is, okay, so I have exactly what you would expect from a debugger. But what other thing is that you get is that the inspection part is part of the overall workflow. So you can always spawn it to the right, and also you can mold it like it was moldable before. Right, you get the same kinds of things. Right, you can switch to different kinds of views of the debugger as well. Okay. So, now I said, one of the things that I said about, and this is another tiny announcement that we're making today, is that besides the Glamorous Toolkit, 2 minutes, besides the Glamorous Toolkit, we're also announcing another thing. So, if documents are a universal language, that means that we need a way to manipulate those, send them around. This is a fundamental thing. Maybe publish them. So we're now launching Xdoc, which is a format. It's a very tiny thing. It's a technical format, so it's not a documentation format. So what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that, let's say that I have, I get my this document over here, right, which is a page, and if I publish it, right, I will say my playground, and I publish it, I get the URL. In this case, it's a local host, and if I go there and I paste it, I get my snippet published, right? And if I copy that URL back, and I go back here and I paste it, I get my tool back. Now notice how I didn't choose which tool to open, right? And that's interesting, and that's important, we think. So why is this important? Well, it's important because, let's go back to a more complicated kind of a thing, so to the Mondrian environment. So here we have the documentation about Mondrian, and if I'm going to publish this one, let's say Mondrian, we call it Mondrian, and I publish this one. It takes a bit of time, and it puts it on this HTML link, so let's look at it. And now, in that HTML thing, I actually have rendered the whole document, right? Because we use the same engine that the books are being produced with. So when I copy that URL and I go back here and I have a blank page, it's just the player, right? And I just pasted the thing that before was a technical thing, right? And I just take a URL that I just received from somebody and I press an enter here. What do I get? I get a document. That's the input place. It's a whole, we have changed the game in how we can guide people to how to start the experience of relating themselves to software, right? No longer start from the code, no longer start from the structure. You start from what makes sense for the end user, right? And now we have a vehicle for doing that. So this basically gets me to the end of what we showed. Now we showed a lot about features, but again, I want to come back to the core of it, and this is the development experience. Because the features are secondary. What's most important is, can we rethink, or how do we rethink how we feel about software? And that's why our focus is not so much, we don't see ourselves as building features, although we do build some of them. We see ourselves crafting a new kind of an experience. And we think that the experience must have a couple of properties. First of all, it has to be moldable, programmable, because it has to be adapted to the context. The second one is it has to be integrated. By integrated means not only do we have to integrate the development or the activities of a developer, but we potentially also want to integrate all other roles around the software system. And for example, documents gets us towards that goal. The other thing is that it has to be visual. Right? Notice how text does not have to be the only representation of software. It was too much tyranny of that text, and we have to break loose of it. And at the end of it, it also has to be beautiful. Because programming is the coolest job on the planet. And we have to enjoy doing that. Because if we don't, right, what chances do our kids have to happiness? Thank you.